Welcome to the first of our Hour of Power, where we have CXO Connect advisors Chris Rivinus and Anthony Bargar discussing the topic of realizing the promise of data in your organization. Chris has over 25 years of experience in IT and digital transformation with a background in cultural anthropology. He has shaped a unique approach to digital that places human beings and culture at the center of his methods. He has led successful transformations in energy and heavy industry companies such as Tullow Oil, Parsons Brinckerhoff, and Energy Aspects. Chris has worked with organizations on 5 continents, from innovative startups to multinational corporations alike. Anthony has served in senior positions within the financial services sector, United States Department of Defense, and intelligence community. Anthony was on the team that rewrote the United States cyber strategy, supported US Homeland Security infrastructure protection, resilience, business continuity, and national telecommunication programs. Anthony's key passion is making organizations more resilient to bad actors by helping clients develop their cyber resilience through cyber operation processes and the implementation of advanced countermeasures. How Forbes stated that businesses often lack a culture that supports data-driven decisions. Instead of compiling the data and letting it work for them, they often make decisions based on gut feelings rather than data. When data initiatives are put into motion, they fail because the organization is not ready for this new decision-making process. So let's see what Chris and Anthony's thoughts are. I hope you enjoy.
So Anthony, thanks for having the chat formally.
Great to be here.
I think one of the reasons I thought this was a good idea was, again, just looking at our different backgrounds and the different approaches that we've taken towards data and towards management of data. And in particular, it struck me again that the organizations that you've been involved with definitely had this real sort of heavy top-down feel to it, a lot of command and control. And then from my perspective, where I've come from is in trying to, again, do a much more of a grassroots bottom-up build in terms of establishing best practice around data management. And so that just clicked into my head that it's maybe an issue of culture and how are we actually, in our different experiences, both trying to drive success in and around data management. What's the role that culture plays in that? And then is there more than one way to approach the problem set? So I thought maybe I'd just start by asking, maybe you can tell everybody a little bit about where you're working now and how you got there.
Sure. No, thanks. I think this is going to be a very good discussion. Well, firstly, to start, I'm sure a lot of people have looked at my background, but I was kind of come from the U.S. intelligence community and Defense Department. And I started in that community very early at a very young age, right out of my undergraduate school at the University of Maryland. But I had a deeper background even before then in information technology, working at a very, very young age. Started programming when I was like 6 years old, and did some not so nice things using technology when it was back in the war games days, if you know what I mean. And that attracted the eye of several people at the FBI and at the National Security Agency when I was just 13 years old. But just saying that, was looked out for, and had several friends in the intelligence community when I was at a young age. And I came to respect what their mission and vision was. And I didn't know much about it, just like anybody, you see what's in the movies. But it was a great place to go with resources to let someone like me, kind of stretch and grow my career. And talking about information, top and bottom approach, my view as a young hacker back then was to look at information diagonally and sideways, right? So it was to try to exploit and use something in a way that people weren't normally looking at it. So I had to take a view from both, the person on the ground in my sense, and working in military intelligence, that was the soldier, out on the battlefield, but also, how the value of information was from the command and control aspect that you mentioned, from top down. And we were, both were pretty much, I think, around the same age. So we saw the evolution of technology through the valuation of information grow exponentially. If you think about what the world was like, when I was doing those things as a 13-year-old in my parents' basement on a Commodore 64, that was 1985. And think about how small the world was then, just not so long ago. It doesn't seem that long ago to me in terms of the value of information in information and technology, and kind of where we are today in 2021. Information can topple governments and people and individuals and organizations and cost billions of dollars when it doesn't work right. It's the new. I was speaking recently with another client about how this world of data and information is almost like a new natural resource, like oil, where we can mine it and harvest it and create value out of information. So it's very, very powerful. And so most of my career has been in this area of advanced information technology and defense and intelligence, and expanding and then into the financial services sector. And since then, other critical infrastructures such as the oil and gas industry and other high-tech infrastructures. And the value and appreciation for data always varies between different cultures. I think that's very important. Most of the cultural organizations I've been involved with are ones that cling to it as a lifeblood, like the intelligence community, of course, has always known information is that important. But now I'm in Southeast Asia and working across the Middle East and Southeast Asia to service clients and bring knowledge about cyber resilience and cyber security and in digital transformations and this new world we all live in. The biggest human digital transformation of all of us working remotely in for the foreseeable future has really propelled this industry that we're in. So this couldn't be a more relevant topic than any time but now.
Amen. Yeah, couldn't agree more. And it's funny that I find myself, I think, agreeing with a lot of what you're saying in terms of, again, the requirements to look at the criticality of data and the role that it plays, and the importance of taking a much more strict and stringent view of how it needs to be protected and effectively managed. But you mentioned 1985. Back in 1985, literally that year, I was having intense arguments with one of my roommates at high school and boarding school because he was coding, and I couldn't figure out for the life of me, why he was wasting his time, messing around with computers. It just, it made no sense. It seemed completely inhuman. My parents were pretty much hippies. And so it was this intense sort of focus on, I was raised with this intense focus on humanity and the importance and the supremacy of sort of the human spirit.
Right.
And so as I started to apologize to my roommate in later years because it was clear he knew something that I didn't. But I had always gotten involved in IT from a bottom-up perspective. Again, the creative elements. How can you connect people with information? I became a real disciple of Peter Drucker and that idea of the knowledge worker, and that frontline workers, if they're actually enabled to make decisions and are empowered often through access to information and data, you're going to get competitive advantage. You're going to unlock potential in your organization. And since my first jobs in IT back in the 90s, in the .com era, right, when we were spinning up websites and going for all kinds of crazy new business models, the speed with which we could move information from one spot to another, it became a shotgun approach, right? It was just like, just give it all, right? Just open all of it, and because we don't know what our creative instincts might create. We're not sure where business value is going to come from out of this explosion of new activity and new ideas. So, actually securing data in some ways, seemed antithetical to driving business value.
Right.
And I was then put into lots of different roles where we were instructed effectively. I mean, one of the roles I was in, which was also in heavy industry, was like, look, we need to, you need to drag us kicking and screaming, into the future. And so you need to break down barriers. You need to bust through things. You need to do things in an unconventional way. And I think the light started to really dawn on me probably, not until probably the late 2000s, when I started to recognize that the methodologies for typing data, for thinking and how to characterize data, from a cybersecurity perspective, you didn't have to extend it that far in terms of the scope of how or the types of characterizations that you were adding to that metadata for those pieces of data to actually then drive dramatic efficiencies in terms of how data was being targeted to individuals.
Right.
And by then we just had way too much data, right? So this idea that you take all of the data and you give it to everybody was just creating a mess. And so I think slowly but surely I saw, even through, sort of best practices around innovation, we moved from this sort of sloppy, paint everywhere kind of creative sense to how you're managing data to being like, no, we got to target this stuff, right? We've got to be really, really focused. And at that point, we saw real synergies, I think, in terms of the methods that cybersecurity professionals were trying to employ in terms of characterizing, categorizing, and then managing data, and then what we actually needed to be doing to drive innovation. But there was still this huge culture clash, right? It was like this difference in the way that we were talking about it or trying to get to that endpoint. And just it was just painful to sit in a room, with the cybersecurity team while we were, thinking Picasso and you guys were thinking architecture, and we, and it was almost a lexicon thing, which is why I'm so keen now to have these types of conversations about where are the similarities and how do we break down sort of these cultural barriers, because I think the path forward is inevitably in a synergy between the efforts, right? And actually looking at, okay, how does this become a more synergistic approach to just data in general? And yes, it has security elements, but wow, it's got operational efficiency elements and creativity elements to it,
Right.
as well.
No, I want to say, just building on that, one of the biggest cultural shifts that I had lived through early on in my career in the U.S. intelligence community was after the terrorist attacks in September 11th, 2001, when there was a tremendous push to understand how this failure of intelligence happened. And importantly, in this chief information officers' offices around the intelligence community, which is where I worked at the time, there was a view on how do we change the mentality away from need to know to need to share, and how do you do that securely? And that is, it sounds easy, but it's fundamentally turning a culture that had been institutionalized in back from the earliest 1940s and 50s of when the intelligence community was formed with code word accessed programs and files upon files locked in separate files within sub-files with only perhaps no real person knowing that the information even existed. And it's easier to secure an environment when you can label everything and you have clear-cut access lists and so forth. But when you need to make information like that, and this is, by the way, this lesson isn't just for the intelligence community, because I have been a part of many organizations who have a similar challenge as data has become valued more and more for personal and business success, that they hold on to it for power. And what the cultural recognition is, once you start to let go of that and make people aware, make organizations and even business partners, and sometimes competitors, sometimes governments, regulators, when you start to make them aware more of the information that's available and why they might need it to consume it, then the world is actually a better place. But from an information security and cybersecurity approach, that is a very much more complex problem to solve, but it's also much more rewarding. And this goes into coming up with the idea of business resilience, right? So as information has become the lifeblood of an organization, leadership has traditionally put it into bins of technical risk, and perhaps they've used older methodologies to manage the risk of that type of information that don't apply. And so those disciplines and communities of risk management have taken some time to catch up to the transformation, all these transformations that have happened. And so back when the intelligence community understood that we needed to turn need to know upside down on its head and share first and provide more information about the data that's available and who might you need to go to if you need to have access to something like that. Because for you as an analyst to put those pieces together, you have to be able to discover it. And that's in any business, right? For your success. The people who design technology systems, while they interface with the business community, true business innovation comes from some person who's able to put things together in a way that haven't been put together before for business advantage. And you want to enable that and empower that. So I try to pitch to organizations that security is not just an insurance policy. Take business risks to share information for your advantage. And so that is a fundamental change. It's still hard to get the right focus in cybersecurity that way because everybody is, stovepipe security into this, firewall box that we're building a castle and we got to keep the bad guys out of the network and so forth. But and also I would say that a lot of people have become desensitized to cyber breaches because they happen so frequently. So it seems like, there's another breach of 40 million records. Honestly, personally, with my medical records and credit records and things like that, they've been leaked 10 times over. So, I don't really care at this point, I'm just gonna be resilient and try to make something happen. I've got so many. I've had, by the way, because of, the Defense Department data was breached with my personnel records. The healthcare through my healthcare provider was breached through those records and so forth. And there's so much information out there on the dark web about us that, I just hope they choke on how to organize it, right? Because there's too much data that's out there.
Oh man, yeah, so I agree. I think it's funny you were talking about the core of resilience as again needing to be able to understand where data is and then
right.
how to access data and in particular types of data. And I would say I don't have anything near as snappy as switch from need to know to need to share, which I think is that's a t-shirt that you should be
right.
you should be selling out there for sure. But I think for us so much of it was trying to shift from this attitude and again also building communities. This idea that so we would start also in terms of building communities, usually of different groups that had some connection through a shared process
right.
or some connection through some sort of shared outcome or shared objective. But then within that community, trying to switch their focus from, I or we, meaning a small subgroup of that greater community, we need this now to then thinking about, okay, well, who might use this eventually?
Right.
And that whole shift from, okay, so we consume this piece of data for this particular part of this process, and we need it to be in this format and for this type of outcome. But then trying to get them in those community settings to think collectively about, okay, yeah, but where does it go next? And then think about, and then trying to trace route effectively pieces or chunks or types of data beyond their sort of initial and immediate reach and domain of influence throughout the organization. And in that push, try to get people to think about, again, the relationship of that piece of data to the health or the benefit of the entire organization.
Right.
And we found when we started doing that in groups and in exercises, and rather than doing a big process mapping exercise, or rather than, again, trying to, look at it through systems implementation, but effectively, again, starting to route data and then type data, that you naturally started to jump into the need to characterize and prioritize data as more essential or less essential.
Right.
And it started to become clear across a group of individuals, possibly from different disciplines and different functions within the organization. Wow, here's the crown jewels, right? Actually, we keep coming back to these 4 or 5 data sets. And then at that point, it became much easier to engage and prioritize resources around cybersecurity and protection, because it was like,
Right.
actually, this is the stuff that we need access to in the event of, some sort of disaster recovery exercise, or B, this is the stuff that actually we need to be as accessible as possible to these groups, or conversely, as inaccessible to, everybody as possible, because this is the stuff. Yeah. And in that, in that, I think also, you were talking about, there was a cooperative element. I keep coming back to that phrase that you use about community, and in that, I think the communities, and again, really taking sort of a bottom up perspective of it, they seem to self-organize, and then again around principles that became, rather than them being enforced upon them, being like, okay, well, we have to do this and we have to categorize this data from your own individual perspective. It was first, again, forcing might be a harsh word, but effectively trying to encourage this breadth of perspective about the organization as a whole, and then acknowledging where their bit of it fit in that context, that then popped open the doors to real alignment with, again, some of the top-down principles that I think we ended up adopting. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
You hit the nail on the head when you gave an overview of the bottom-up approach about identifying those crown jewels of data. And the challenge, because that is a core tenet in my favorite subject of cyber resilience and mission assurance, or business continuity, because oftentimes, by the way, that concept of business continuity has been traditionally looked at as like a flood or a hurricane, not a hurricane that can follow you, right? That has an element behind it. So those plans need to be, turned around and put on their head from a cyber adversary perspective. But only that can only be possible when you have done your crown jewel analysis, as you stated, and that always has to be done from a painstakingly bottom-up perspective. But what I've noticed is that those constructs from the top-down perspective aren't mature enough to comprehend that level of crown jewel, and particularly around data. And what I mean by that is that most organizations have a risk ontology that looks at information and data as not as the same value, right? So they don't consider that information has a time value, or maybe we shouldn't keep this information because it's perishable. There isn't. I don't see a lot of focus in that, and not unless it's a really mature organization, right? That's born of data that already should know that, right? So there a lot of these principles around data retention and perishability, and how important it is, and of course its level of confidence, because so many organizations have a cyber breach, right? So there was recently, where was the big cyber breach that happened? Oh, well, recently at the U.S. Capitol, right? So people are looking at that from a cyber breach perspective, because should you trust anything on the network at this point, because there was unlocked workstations and so forth for a period of time. So did the confidence in all of that data go down significantly? Should it? How should that be studied? How should that be tracked? How do you know? What was the integrity check of that data? Because I'm sure there's a lot of crown jewels in that data. And so, that's a perfect example. But there's a lot of other examples about cyber breaches that happen, and then organizations just cobble back the network and put up the firewall and say, okay, we're going to just pretend, that everything's okay on the inside. So those are some concerns. But really, when we talk about resilience, it's the concept that security is a panacea that we're never, no matter how much we invest, it cannot outpace the little investment an adversary has to follow to find that what we call the principle is the easiest penetration. They've just got to find that one way in. And you've got to outspend them to prevent all of the ways in. And once they're in, how do you detect if they're not there already, right? Because most organizations have a cyber breach for 6 months or more before it's detected. So what are they doing on the network? What is your ability to detect what that's happening? But the only way that it's possible to be resilient is to draw the defense around that boundary of your most critical capabilities and spend a lot to protect that, because that's the lifeblood of your organization. And there are many approaches that can be taken with that. We're not talking for an extensive period of time today, but that could be an entire, hour-long discussion about cyber resilience for business assurance. How do you do crown jewel analysis and so forth? So I think these are all areas that organizations should think about when they're designing their top-down processes, to consider how they plug in to these grassroots efforts that happen that define criticality and assets and perishability of data and so forth, and how do they consider that from a risk perspective?
Yeah, and I agree there as well, right? It was interesting. It caught my ears when you said, "Oh, sometimes these top-down, initiatives or principles or the governance isn't mature enough to actually somehow be fit for purpose."
Right.
And so I do think, for me, in addition to, well, what are those crown jewels? And again, when you talk about resilience and then getting back up and running, it's like, okay, well, those are the crown jewels, but what do we do with them, right? Do you have to connect people, and which people do you have to connect to those crown jewels to actually then breathe life into them and breathe value into them? And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have a completely a process that just needs to run. But I think it is, and I love, again, it just keeps coming back to that community and the crucibles in which you're actually creating that synergy between the top-down principle, maybe, right? It's like, okay, look, we've got these top-down governance bits, and maybe the directives that are coming out are not quite fit for purpose. But let's have a look at the principles here, right? What are we actually talking about? And then how do we apply the intelligence and the knowledge that the frontline staff have to actually then curate that those directives and the specific procedures that are going to come out of that, or the specific parameters that are going to come out of that in terms of a governance, to be literally fit for purpose. And there's a whole, and again, I would say, again, coming from my perspective, wow, did we resisted that like the plague, right? It's like, please, can we just have access, and can we just have freedom, and can we be much more self-directed? But really, at the end of the day, what you find is that that's all well and good as long as everything's going okay. But the minute that you do have a problem or a fault, people need to organize around where to go and what to do and how to get back up and running. And if, as an individual creative person, you don't have a clear sense of where you're fitting in that overarching picture, then you actually are, you're not part of the solution. Then in that recovery process, you're part of the, you're something to be managed. And it is, I think, the focus on those principles in the top down, as it starts to, again, as you start to interpret those things and make them fit for purpose for your own individual community or your own individual subgroup within that community, that then brings your understanding of the end to end. And again, I think that, maybe it's we're taking a step further from just the knowledge worker to being the enlightened knowledge worker, right? So not only do I understand my spot and what I need to do, whether it's for creating value or disaster recovery, but actually now I understand something about where that fits, and maybe where that fits in the priority of how this business actually creates value. And so I think, there and the thing that we're not talking about, right, that's just a massive piece of all of this, is leadership, right? And the role of leadership to both drive from top down and then enable from bottom up, and then to, hopefully distill messages down so that people feel like they're actually connecting with this. But that to me is again, the real power of where this synergy can happen, right? Is when you do get that top down directive, and you've digested that principle, and you've made it work for particular subgroups within your organization, while maintaining some thread of continuity through those different interpretations. Man, if you got something powerful and you've got enlightened, individuals within your organization that get how this end-to-end value chain works, what happens when it's broken, and where to go and what to do to try to get it back up and running again.
Well, I think that's great because you mentioned the enlightened knowledge worker in knowledge management, and I think the fastest path to enlightenment is trial by fire. And I don't mean a real cyber breach, but I mean a simulated one. So one of the things I mention to a lot of organizations who struggle, and oftentimes they do training like this just to check a regulatory box. And I'm not talking about that type of training. I'm talking almost similar to having a process reengineering exercise, that typical organizations go through, but combining that with a cyber exercise and taking it seriously, that is well designed to stress the pain points of the organization, where there's very, very structured ground rules set, and there's a good facilitation to point out where these processes break down at the top down, at the bottom up. And oftentimes it comes down to communication and in the knowledge circles that you mentioned. And sometimes they don't consider about the loss of confidence or regular normal communication pathways and things like that. A lot of people are realizing that now because of COVID. And I'll tell you, I've been a part of these type of continuity exercises within the US government, where the balloon goes up, it's simulated World War III, and we're trying to communicate, and we're in an isolation tank, and you've got to send smoke signals or something like that, right? So it's you've got to be creative with how to restore confidence in communications, how to capture the lessons indicated. Some people call them lessons learned, but I find not many people learn the lessons, so I call them lessons indicated now. And but it's important to have a good process that feeds into improvement in this spiral development that we're all on a constant path to enlightenment within our information and communications technologies community. And I think having a cyber drill or cyber exercise is the fastest way to have that dose of reality. It's got to be based on realistic scenarios. It's got to have some outside influence of someone who knows, what are the gotchas that are going to surprise, because you want to have genuine tech surprise, in some of these. So you all work through adversity as a team. These need to be team-based, and they need to involve leadership and at the working level, so you can harmonize that top-down, bottom-up approach that we talked about. But I think that's a solid thing that organizations should put in their budget lines for doing over the next couple of years, is at least annually having a very good cyber exercise and with different teams.
I think so. And again, I just think that the threat is becoming ever more present and palpable. I think you talked about the number of times that your personal data had been copied, breached and copied, and I do think that there's a similar level of disruption coming for a lot of organizations around this, and you talked about, again, the simple things that break down during a cyber exercise, and again, for us, a lot of what breaks down is communication about shared process, or where there's a handoff, right? It's effectively, well, we kind of know what's going on here, and then we just sort of chuck things over, excuse the phrase, but chuck things over a firewall, and then they pick up the ball and they run with it, but we've got no idea ultimately what they do with it or why, and it is, we've certainly found that it is those intersections between between functions or between groups that have a shared process, where that wow, does it break down in a hurry, number one, and number two, nobody knows exactly who's responsible for picking it up and then reestablishing the middle of the bridge, right? Everybody's our half of the bridge, or our part of the bridge over here, we get started, and they always come to us, or they feel like, well, our part of the bridge we maintain over over here and they always come to us. But when that bridge breaks down, who's actually accountable and responsible for making sure that it's rebuilt in terms of a communication pathway, but then also in terms of data flow and in terms of in terms of process execution, who's actually responsible and accountable for that end-to-end process. So we've always found that, again, as we start to go through exercises, whether it's, again, thinking about a system upgrade, or whether it's actually thinking through some sort of desktop cybersecurity exercise, you do start sort of heading back up the food chain, right? And leadership becomes more and more important, because you need to find people who ultimately have the authority to make decisions about that end-to-end process,
right,
so that those gaps can actually be addressed, and there can be something put into place that actually has a certain amount of resilience to it, or a certain amount of strength to it, so that if challenged, it can bounce back. But what then you find is that the individuals that you're talking to didn't even know the process existed in the first place, because they're at such a layer of abstraction in the organization. So again, I think it comes back to that the importance of that grassroots effort. You need to have people at that front line who can then act on behalf of a theoretical position of authority, not a theoretical position of authority, but a position of authority that needs to delegate the true understanding of where to go and what to do back down. And so you start to thread and, I think, knit these points of strength through various layers of the organization, from frontline worker all the way up through leadership. And I agree with you. I think these exercises, particularly if they're looked at and you understand the implications and what you're going to learn from these exercises beyond just cyber resilience, but actually to operational efficiency, actually to, these are probably the same points that we can look at to actually improve business performance, even when things are going fine. Yeah.
And you mentioned a couple of things about the disparity between leadership and at the operational level. I wanted to mention, because I experienced this when later in my career I worked for the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I heard a lot of new terms, and I was always the Washington D.C. guy at that point, because we were trying to command and control from the Pentagon. But what I heard a lot about was the pointy end of the spear, meaning the soldier way out on the front lines in the battlefield. And then I heard a lot about trying to fix things with the, a couple 1,000-mile screwdriver from Washington, D.C. to adjust settings down in the field. So there was a really careful art to writing policy and strategy at that level to make it flexible enough, and also to instill and empower the frontline camp base post or station commander, that if the balloon did go up and you needed to have a resilient response, that they had the authority to make decisions and, within a certain range. And then there's always, people just doing what they need to do to get the job done. In fact, a lot of the times in my career, I got sent out to the battlefield. I went out to a couple of war zones and a couple of times where I had to implement or observe or fix or try to fix. They sent me with the mission. First of all, we heard this is going on out on the front lines. This is a cyber security incident of amazing bad potential. You need to go out and do it. And what I did on one occasion, without going into all of the details, it was about intelligence requirements from, gathering from, it was during the no-fly zone mission, watching Southern Watch between watching the Iraq where the military was flying, because they weren't allowed to fly over a certain geographical location. And they set up an ability to share intelligence between the U.S. and the UK. And there was some people were bending the rules, but it was for a mission need. So I went there and understood how they were doing the business, re-architected what they did to where it technically complied with the rules, but gave them training on how they could get their mission done. And then went back to Washington, D.C. and told them, you really don't understand, how it works out there in the field, right? And then I became their advocate to try to change that policy, because they needed to really get their mission done. And it was based upon some bureaucrat's idea of how to protect data versus what they needed to do in the field to get the job done, which was perfectly okay. The solution they came up with, they had the right intent and idea. So I just had to make sure technically it could work the right way. So those were a lot of lessons that I learned early on about the 1,000-mile screwdriver from Washington, D.C. to try to fix problems and what people in the field do to get the mission done. So I've always brought that into the private sector and critical infrastructure clients that I advise. It's how to artfully create the governance process to have flexibility and empowerment into their cyber and information security system. So that's important. But still to keep a mindset on informed risk.
Yeah, and I agree. A similar experience again coming from the other direction. Again, working in civil engineering, but also in the oil and gas industry, where again safety is paramount, right? And again, the intersection of digital and cybersecurity with physical safety through Internet of Things and industrial control systems, is now a real big hot topic on rigs and FPSOs and the like. So, but it's the same experience ultimately as we start to think through. All right, how can we leverage the experience that we have on board or on this platform to actually improve performance locally? But then making sure that we're trying to stay in touch with what's happening in terms of cybersecurity directives and thinking about that risk perspective. And the bit that you're bringing that we often haven't had in the past, but I think is becoming more a part of sort of standard operating procedure from cybersecurity teams is that flexibility, right? Is that ability to go in and say, what's the principle that needs to be applied? What's the risk that we need to think about? But then take into consideration, again, the extraordinarily physically challenging, physically risky activities that are happening out, on an offshore rig, and then try to make some sort of sense out of all of that, right? Because now I think we're particularly that's a great example of where again cyber risk and physical risk are commingling. And you have these paradigms about how information should be managed to mitigate one side or the other. And you don't always have a complete alignment there, right? You do have to make trade-offs and decisions. So you need to understand the underlying principles. You need to understand also the underlying values of the organization, and as well as ethics and everything else to then start making those decisions. So again, coming back to again what I think you said, which is that dialogue. It's like, oh, yeah, awesome, they sent you out there, right? It's so important, I think, to bring both that again the governance and the principles of whatever risk management paradigm that you need to apply, but man, make sure that you're in touch again with the frontline staff and the frontline workers to make sure that it's informed, that it's intelligent, that the way that it's being applied is both compliant with the principles and the overarching ideas, but at the same time works whether it's for improved performance, whether it's for improved safety at that frontline level. Same thing, where we always again in the clients that I advise, we're always trying to get that balance. We're always trying to make sure that we can find that sweet spot between again adherence to a principle versus making it practical on the ground. And the key is understanding. The key is shared understanding between various levels, between various groups of the organization.
Yep, very good. I would say that another area that I think is underaddressed regarding data and information is having an appropriate classification and labeling scheme for sensitivity, criticality, and also the confidence, which is kind of new. So I don't expect most organizations to be, thinking that far ahead. They need to be. But for example, if data was part of a network that had been breached, but it's unsure whether it's good or bad, that there's some confidence meter that's set. But because now, people focus too much on data that's stolen, where they're not thinking so much about data that might have been manipulated. And I think a lot of people are thinking about that now at the Capitol. But I will say that going back to what I mentioned earlier about data classification, there is a lot of differing methodologies that I've seen, and some of them aren't used consistently. They don't know what they have or how sensitive it is. And I think that is a fundamental place to start to invest in understanding what you care about, how you give access to organizations, how do you control it when it leaves your organization, and then how do you label it, recognize it, tag it, track it, and locate it. We had this big program in the government about tag, track, and locate for data, not just individuals. We had that too, but I'm talking about data. But anyway.
Well, and I agree, and I think again the thing that companies need to be thinking about, again, that we keep challenging them on, if they want to do a systems upgrade, if they want to approach data, oh well, we've got to do something around data science, or we've got to do something around big data. It is the establishment of a shared understanding, a shared model, right? And the types of classification that you're talking about in terms of criticality or confidence, I think are really, really important. But also establishing that top level taxonomic structure, or that top level organizational set of principles. It's like, well, how do we think about data across this organization, right? And again, in oil and gas, we often looked at things which were tagged to assets, right? It's like, okay, so maybe our top level, metadata, or our top level data characterization principles would be around, well, is it tagged to a geography? Is it tagged to an asset? Is it time stamped, right? And these overarching principles, thinking about how we think about data, because it is also, again, buried in what you were saying in terms of resilience and risk, also has a foundational element for improving performance, and that is the ability to locate stuff, right? Yep. And it's more than, oh well, all of this type of data are in these servers, which are in this server room, which is in this this particular geographic location. It's about how do individuals think through classification schemes, so that if they are in a brand new environment, maybe using a new tool, or maybe they've just swapped departments or whatever it is, there's some organizational principle that they're familiar with already, that they can go and they can be like, well, I know that things are going to be organized hierarchically kind of like this. Right. And it is that familiarity that they can then take with them from one scenario to another, apply it, and it actually improves performance. It makes locating a particular piece of information or data, if you're not exactly sure where it is and it's not bookmarked, it makes it faster, and then that improves people's performance. Beyond just disaster recovery or responding to an incident, it improves their performance throughout the life cycle of business activity. Yeah,
a lot of the work I'm doing in industrial control systems now regarding security of the properties of IoT systems from a security standpoint has incredible value from an operational and maintenance perspective. So I've had to become a little more versed in those enhancements, because it helps sell the idea that they need to do it, right? But it makes sense, right? Data is data, and it's like I mentioned earlier, it's like a new natural resource. It's up to you to harvest it. That's why, for example, there's a lot of companies out there selling, and I hate buzzwords. You mentioned big data earlier. I'm glad I don't hear that so much anymore. There was a period I heard big data and Hadoop every other sentence from vendors, and it used to drive me nuts. But cyber threat intelligence, right? That was a big buzzword that I hope we're almost over. And what I try to explain to organizations, because they're all about what's the best CTI feed, what's the best cyber threat feed, where do I buy the best one? And I'm like, well, the best intelligence is what you can make yourself, because nobody knows you like you, and you should know you more than your adversary. So why don't you focus on turning on all those audit logs that are currently turned off, putting some honeypots and sophisticated ones out there, and gathering your own cyber threat intelligence. And wait, there's more. You can start to create agreements with your vendors and service providers that you share information with them, make it part of the contracts. If you have a maintenance company that is making ungodly amounts of money by servicing your IT equipment, that you put in the contract that they will provide you the audit logs from their data servers where they're storing your maintenance data, things like that, because you can start to look at third-party risk in a whole different way when you start to understand. And adversaries are getting smarter like that. It's not, and it's also the cloud providers too, right? It's, just remember, a cloud is just somebody else's computer, and so you want to make sure, that you have access to those type of logs. So the legal aspect of contracts and security are very important when looking at third-party risk. And back to this point of cyber threat intelligence, that's the best value that you can get, is to make it and harvest it yourself.
Well, I think we are basically out of time. I definitely enjoyed the conversation. I learn a lot every time I talk to you. So I appreciate you sharing.
No, it's good stuff. It was a good conversation. Look forward to the next one.
All right.
All right. Thank you.